Adrian Newey just said something that could change everything for Mercedes. Not a direct accusation. Something far more dangerous. A technical detail that points straight at the heart of the W17. Because while Mercedes dominated the Chinese Grand Prix, looking smooth, controlled, almost untouchable, Newey revealed where that performance might really be coming from. And it's not just aerodynamics. It's not just driving. It's something much deeper. Energy. How it's created. How it's deployed. And possibly, how it's being pushed beyond what others can achieve. Now here's why this is exploding inside the paddock. Mercedes didn't just win in China. They made the limits disappear. No energy drop. No clipping at the end of the straight. Just continuous power, lap after lap. And Newey has been warning about exactly this. That in this new era, if one team unlocks the engine and energy system, the rest can't catch them. So now the question is no longer how Mercedes won. It's how they're generating that advantage in the first place. Because if Newey is right, this is not just performance. This is a potential loophole. And if that's true, the FIA has no choice but to step in. So the real question is, did Mercedes simply build the best car? Or did Newey just expose something that could change the entire season? What makes Newey's words so powerful is not what he confirmed. It's what he suggested. Because he didn't say Mercedes is illegal. He didn't say they broke the rules. He pointed at something much more uncomfortable. A gray area. A space where performance becomes difficult to measure. Now think about what he's really talking about. Not just power. Not just speed. Efficiency. How much energy you can extract. And how effectively you can deploy it. Because in this new era, that's everything. And according to what's being discussed, Mercedes might not just be better at it. They might be operating in a completely different window. Now here's where it gets serious. Because one of the key discussions inside the paddock is how engine compression is actually measured. On paper, there are limits. Clear ones. But in reality, those limits depend on how and when you measure them. Cold, static, controlled, or, under real race conditions, hot, dynamic, pushing the system to its edge. And that difference changes everything. Because if a system behaves differently under load, then what looks legal in one scenario might operate very differently on track. Now connect that to what we saw in China. Mercedes didn't just have more power. They had more usable power. Longer deployment. Smoother delivery. No visible loss at the end of the straight. And that's exactly the kind of behavior that would come from a deeper efficiency advantage. Not just a stronger engine. A smarter one. Now add another layer. Newey didn't just focus on the engine itself. He talked about integration. How everything works together. Power unit. Electrical systems, chassis, aerodynamics, all aligned, all optimized around energy flow. And that's the real secret. Because when everything is synchronized, you don't just gain performance, you remove friction inside the system. And that's why the car looks so stable, so predictable, so easy to drive. Now compare that to the rest. Red Bull, fighting instability. Ferrari, close but still managing limits. Others, nowhere near that level of control. And that's where the discomfort grows. Because if one team has solved both power and control at the same time, then they're not just ahead, they're unreachable. Unless something changes. Now here's the critical point. Because Newey's comments are not just technical. They are political. They create pressure. Pressure on the FIA to look closer. To redefine how these systems are measured. To close any gap between the written rules and real-world behavior. And if that happens, everything shifts. Because Mercedes' advantage might not disappear, but it could shrink. Fast. Now imagine the impact. The same car, the same drivers, but slightly less efficiency, slightly less deployment, slightly more limitation. And suddenly, the dominance looks different. Now bring this back to China one more time. Because that race was the first clear signal. The first time the gap was impossible to ignore. And now, Newey may have just explained why that gap exists. So the real tension begins here. Not on track, but off it. In how the sport reacts. Because if the FIA decides to look deeper and redefine that gray area, then what we saw in China might not last. And if it doesn't, then that dominant performance was not just a victory. It was a moment. A moment where Mercedes reached the edge, right before the sport started to push back. But here's where this situation becomes impossible for the FIA to ignore. Because once a gray area turns into a visible advantage, it stops being technical and becomes political. Now imagine what is happening behind closed doors. Ferrari engineers reviewing data, Honda analyzing energy traces, Red Bull questioning every phase of deployment, all looking at the same thing, Mercedes, and all reaching the same conclusion. There is something different here. Not just faster, different. And in Formula One, that's where pressure begins. Because if multiple teams cannot replicate what you're doing, they don't try forever. They push for answers. They push for clarification. They push the FIA to act. Now here's the key detail. The FIA doesn't like reacting late. Because the longer an advantage exists, the harder it becomes to remove. Teams build around it, develop around it, depend on it. So when something appears this early, in the second race of a new era, it creates urgency. Not public urgency, internal urgency. Now connect this to Newey again. Because his words are not random. They are strategic. He's not just explaining a concept. He's pointing the spotlight directly at the area that matters most. Engine efficiency, energy deployment, measurement methods. Because if you change how those are defined, you change everything. Now imagine the scenario. The FIA introduces a clarification. A new way of measuring compression. A new control on how energy is deployed. A small technical directive. Nothing dramatic, but enough. Enough to close the gap. And suddenly, Mercedes loses the very thing that made them untouchable. Now here's where it becomes critical. Because this wouldn't just affect one race. It would affect development. Everything Mercedes has built would need to adapt quickly. And in Formula One, adapting under pressure is where mistakes happen. Now add another layer. Confidence. Because right now, Mercedes looks unbeatable. The car works. The system works. Everything is aligned. But the moment the FIA steps in, even slightly, that confidence gets tested. Engineers start questioning. Drivers feel the difference. Decisions become more cautious. And that's when performance starts to drop. Not dramatically, but enough. Always enough. Now bring this back to the bigger picture. Because this is not just about Mercedes. It's about the direction of the entire sport. If the FIA allows this advantage to continue, Mercedes defines the era. But if they intervene, they reshape it. And that's why this moment matters so much. Because we are not just watching a dominant team. We are watching a potential turning point. Now everything leads to one final moment. The next races. Because that's where pressure becomes visible. If Mercedes continues to dominate, under scrutiny, then they've truly solved the system. But if something changes, if the gap shrinks, if the consistency breaks, then we will know that what Newey pointed at was not just theory. It was the beginning of the sport pushing back. And when Formula One pushes back, it never does it halfway. And this is where everything reaches its breaking point. Because at this stage, it's no longer about what Mercedes has done. It's about whether Formula One will allow it to continue. Because once a concept becomes this powerful, this early, the sport is forced to make a decision. Let it evolve, or bring it back. And that decision changes everything. Now think about the position the FIA is in. If they do nothing, Mercedes keeps the advantage. They build on it. They extend the gap. And very quickly, the championship starts slipping away from everyone else. But if they step in, even slightly, they risk something else. Controversy, debate, questions about fairness. Because the moment you change how something is measured, you change the competitive order. And that is never simple. Now imagine what's happening behind the scenes. Meetings, technical discussions, data comparisons from China, simulations being run over and over again, trying to answer one question. Is this within the intention of the rules? Not just legal. Intended. Because in Formula One, that distinction is everything. Now bring Newey back into the center of this. Because what he did was shift the focus from performance to interpretation, from speed to how that speed is created. And once that shift happens, the conversation changes completely. Now it's no longer about chasing Mercedes. It's about redefining the limits. Now here's the part that could decide the entire season. Because if the FIA introduces a clarification soon, Mercedes has to react. Immediately. No time to slowly adapt. No time to redesign. They have to adjust on the spot. And that's where dominance becomes fragile. Because when you remove even a small part of a perfectly optimized system, the whole balance shifts. The car feels different. The behavior changes. The confidence drops. And suddenly, what looked unstoppable becomes vulnerable. Now imagine the next race under that scenario. Mercedes arrives, but something is different. Maybe the power doesn't hold as long. Maybe the deployment isn't as smooth. Maybe the advantage on the straight is smaller. Nothing dramatic, but enough. Enough for rivals to notice. Enough for the gap to shrink. And that's when everything flips. Because in Formula 1, you don't need to lose everything to lose control. You just need to lose enough. Now here's the final layer. Because this is not just about Mercedes reacting. It's about everyone else. Because the moment that advantage is reduced, even slightly, Ferrari is there. Red Bull is there. Waiting. Ready to take advantage. And suddenly, the championship fight comes alive again. Now bring it all together. China showed us the peak. Newey pointed at the reason. The FIA is now under pressure. And the next races will reveal the outcome. So this is the real conclusion. Not confirmed. Not announced. But already unfolding. Because what happened in China was never going to stay isolated. It was always going to lead here. To a moment where Formula 1 decides whether Mercedes has truly mastered the system, or whether they've gone just far enough to force the sport to pull them back. And when that decision finally shows itself, it won't come with a statement. It will come on track, in lap times, in gaps, in performance. And when it does, everything we thought we understood about this season will change. And when that moment finally arrives, there is no hiding from it. Because Formula 1 has a way of revealing the truth without saying a single word. No announcements. No headlines. Just performance. Now imagine the next few races unfolding. Mercedes lines up on the grid. Same car. Same drivers. Same expectations. But something feels different. Not obvious at first. Not dramatic. Just slightly less perfect. Maybe the energy fades a little earlier. Maybe the straight line advantage isn't as overwhelming. Maybe the gap doesn't open as easily as it did in China. And that's all it takes. Because in Formula 1, the smallest change tells the biggest story. Now picture the reaction. Engineers from rival teams watching the data, comparing every lap to China, looking for confirmation. And when they see it, they don't celebrate. They understand. Something has changed. Now here's where everything becomes clear. Because if Mercedes loses even a fraction of that advantage, then China stops being the beginning of dominance and becomes something else. A peak. The highest point of an interpretation, right before it was brought back into line. Now flip the scenario. Because this is where it becomes even more powerful. If nothing changes, if Mercedes shows up and looks just as dominant, just as consistent, just as untouchable, then the message is even bigger. They didn't just exploit the rules. They mastered them. Completely. And at that point, there is no investigation that slows them down. No pressure that affects them. They become the reference. The standard. The team everyone else has to chase. Now bring Newey back into this one final time. Because his role in this story was never to accuse. It was to highlight. To point at the exact area where the difference exists. And once that spotlight is there, the sport cannot ignore it. So everything we've seen, everything we've built, leads to this exact conclusion. China was not just a race. It was a trigger. A moment that forced Formula 1 to look closer. To question. To analyze. To react. And now, the entire season depends on what happens next. Because this is the real battle. Not just on track, but between innovation and regulation. Between pushing the limits and defining them. So now there is only one thing left. To watch. Because the answer is coming. Not from the FIA. Not from Mercedes. From the track itself. And when it shows, there will be no debate left. Only the truth. About whether Mercedes truly built something unstoppable. Or whether they went just far enough to force Formula 1 to pull them back.